All right. That's the excitement I want to hear. Um, yeah, welcome, fellow Celo enthusiasts. It's great to have you all here. Um, it's been a pleasure to see so many of you face to face for like the first time in ages. And yeah, I'm gonna speak about Mento 2.0, a sustainable stable asset protocol. So what's this talk about? What's really the goal here of this presentation? And basically the context you need for that, to figure that out, is basically that a group of folks in the ecosystem, partly cLabs, partly others, came together to figure out how a new version of the stability protocol could look like. And on a super high level, I think we identified like 3 focus areas. We want Mento 2.0, so the new version of the stability protocol, to be environmentally sustainable. Marcus and Bobo talked about this today, earlier. Bobo, it's here. If you have questions, this is Bobo. In a lot of detail about focusing on this aspect of things. We want Mento 2 to be technically sustainable. That means more, scalability, tooling, and all these things. And many of these things actually Volpe touched in his talk just now. And this talk really is about the last of these 3 focus areas, which is we want Mento 2.0 to be economically and socially sustainable. And, well, this particular talk is aiming to just basically kick off the discussion here. How can we find a design that's economically and socially sustainable? How can we structure all the things, that we've learned, the problems that we are seeing, and so forth, in a good way, so we can, as a community, figure out what Mento 2.0 should look like. That's really the core goal. So before we go into detail, why do we even need a Mento 2.0? Why should we invest in this? And I think worth mentioning, Mento, I call it Mento 1.0 for now, just to make sure people see the difference. Mento 1.0, so the current stability protocol, is working as intended since launch, which is great news. So no major defects or anything like that. Nothing bad happening for the last few years since launch. But we realized that Mento can be more than what it is right now. And with every partnership that Celo is making and every person entering the ecosystem, the stakes just keep on rising. So of course, what was good enough at some point might not be good enough anymore, in the not too distant future. So basically, over the last 2 years since launch, we of course talked to a lot of different people about the stability protocol. And it's just really interesting how different perspectives are on what we should do when we come up with a new system here. When you talk to users, they have very specific ways of looking at things. They want like very concrete things that they're able to do. Maybe swap Celo Euro to Celo USD directly without going via Celo, right? Like these kind of things are user requests that are coming our way. But if you talk to folks who work in the ecosystem, maybe on institutional partnerships, they usually have a totally different perspective and totally different asks. And basically, what the next couple of slides try to do is, well, we want to structure, or we tried to structure as good as we can after talking to so many different people and getting all that input. We wanted to structure this whole bunch of asks for feature requests and properties for a new Mento. The learnings that we were seeing ourselves or having ourselves over the last 2 years, but also the ones that were communicated to us about things that didn't go well, like shortcomings and so forth. And interestingly, also, we want to structure like the proposed solutions that are out there, because it's interesting, whoever you talk to, I think everybody kind of has an idea about what we should do to improve Mento, right? And again, understandably so, the perspectives are super different, right? Like people always come from a certain angle, and they usually say, well, this is what we should do, this will solve all our problems. But of course, other people might disagree with that. So we're basically, I think, in the position here that we get all this brain dump from all sides and try to find structure here to make this community effort a bit easier. Okay, so let's try to find a structure in the asks, the learnings, and the solutions that came our way. Let's start with the asks. So we basically looked at all the asks that came our way and tried to find like an underlying structure there and basically core goals that underlie all these different asks. And the ones we came up with here are the following 5 goals. First one, people want us to improve long-term stability and black swan robustness. Fair enough, right? Like, just because Mento has been stable so far, that doesn't mean that it necessarily will be stable forever in the current design. So let's make sure that we improve long-term stability and crisis robustness, basically. Then people ask us to make Mento more participatory and improve the democratization of profits. So basically, people came our way saying stuff like, there's not much you can do in Mento right now, right? You can literally just buy and sell against the reserve at this point, and that's it, right? And it's kind of sad because maybe there are other things people would like to contribute to the system, make sure it works better, and earn some profit while doing it, right? And we should probably foster that engagement. Third, we want to better support sustainable growth. It's clear that, for example, potential institutional partners have very specific requirements, maybe on the stability mechanism. One that is coming around a lot is that institutional clients want us to be able, basically, to mint large amounts of stable tokens very quickly and very cost efficiently, which is quite hard to do in the current system because there is like this trade-off between liquidity, basically, and protection of the reserve. So asks that come basically our way, many coming from the more institutional side of things, they often fit into category number 3. Then the fourth one, further decentralize the reserve. Well, I think we all want that, and a lot of the asks aim basically in that direction and fall into that category. And then the fifth goal that we identified from like all these asks that come our way is to better support natural capital reserve assets. And as you know, Celo is committed to put a huge fraction of like the total reserve into natural capital assets. But they come with certain properties, especially around liquidity and so forth. And currently the mechanism isn't perfectly designed to account for them. So many asks that go in that direction basically therefore end up, I guess, fitting that category. We need to better support them in the reserve. Those 5 goals are not final. So if you have an ask in mind, something that you would like Mento to be able to do, and it doesn't fit those 5 categories, please reach out. We're trying to structure these things, and that's just kind of where we are right now. Okay, now the question was, well, we have structured the asks into basically the underlying goals. Now, the question is, how can we structure all the learnings that we had over the last 2 years since mainnet launch, basically? And yeah, how can we even approach this problem? There are so many different learnings that we had, things that didn't quite work well, maybe for like a day or two, but all these things seemed really unrelated, and we thought about, how can we find a common theme here? And I guess, looking at the 5 goals again, it seems like there's one goal that is ruling them all in a sense, and that's the first one, right? Why is it ruling them all? Well, it's kind of a prerequisite for the other goals, right? Like if we don't have a system that's long-term stable and crisis resistant, it's not even worth pursuing the other goals that much, right? Like at some point things break, so what do you achieve by even trying to solve the other problems? So we saw that the first goal is absolutely fundamental. And therefore, we thought about, okay, we have so many learnings, all these goals somehow relate back to kind of the first goal, so why not ask how we can find structure about the first goal and the learnings we had towards it. And we did that basically by asking, what can go wrong with liquidity? What is it really that makes, number one break? And what are the fundamental categories here of things that can go wrong? And, well, the first two you see on this slide, we actually had them explicitly stated in the first version of the stability paper already. So when we came up with the first version of Mento, those two we already had on the radar. We just now have a couple of additional learnings since then that fall into that category. So the two I'm talking about here are liquidity and collateral. Liquidity, basically, well, if the market is very illiquid, then incentive mechanisms cannot really work at a large scale. So you cannot expand or contract huge amounts quickly, right? And that can lead to DBACs. And the second thing being here collateral. So if there is no collateral left in the reserve and somebody wants to return stable tokens, then, well, you have nothing to give in return, right? And that's, of course, an obvious source for DPAC. Now, some things we learned, and those are just examples basically along the way regarding those two categories, is that, for example, with liquidity, nature capital assets are a bit problematic in that regard because they come with very limited liquidity, at least at the moment, right? So basically, it's definitely learning that we need to adjust things somehow if we want to allow for natural capital assets to a large extent in the reserve. Learnings with respect to collateral over the last years were, well, hedging is really, really hard on a large scale. Right? We kind of imagined that we can just hedge downside risk of the reserve, in some near future. But the reserve is quite big, and hedging that downside risk efficiently is not really that easy to do. Also, we realized that there's not much you can actually do to help if there's ever a collateral problem in the reserve, which feels not great. So basically saying if any of us observe that the reserve is getting quite low in terms of collateral, there's not really much we can do at this point. We can just, basically all we can do is give away Celo for free and send it to the reserve smart contract, but that's kind of a big ask, right? It's just really giving away money. It would be nice if users had a way to actually support the reserve in a reasonable kind of way. And third here, well, we saw from simulations that actually a lot of states, a lot of future evolvements end up with a unnecessarily large reserve. And that makes intuitive sense because if we have, for example, a system that, isn't really going anywhere, let's say, the Celo dollar supply and the other stable token supplies are kind of flat. Celo is, doing okay, but not doing great. But at the same time, Bitcoin and Ether and other reserve currency is going to the moon. Well, then all of a sudden we have a huge reserve that we actually don't need, right? And that's problematic because it shows that there is quite some inefficiency from an economic perspective here. Like, we would like to take that value and transfer it to states where we actually need that value, right? Having it in those situations doesn't really help. So let's try to transfer it. Now, those two, in the original stability white paper, we kind of knew about them, of course, when we first created the Mento mechanism 1.0. But now we identified actually two more things, or we had two more kind of fundamental learnings, I think, since then. The first one is around incentives. I guess in one sentence, I think the key learning here for me is that it's not realistic to get incentives right at every moment in time. It's just not something you should even try to do. And to shed some light on that, so probably many of you know this Olympus-DAO game theory matrix. I think a lot of people loved it and had 3 in their Twitter name, right? And the idea basically was, well, let's look at what people can do, stake, bond, and sell. Let's, make a payoff game theory matrix and figure out like where would be an equilibrium with these payoffs, right? And it's, kind of nice, but like the outcome, stake, well, that's a Nash equilibrium basically in this case. But I guess of course, this is a simplification. It was always meant to be, but I think it's one that's very dangerous because actually these payoffs are extremely time-varying in reality, right? And what we realized is that you shouldn't even try to build a system that basically relies on these incentives being correct at every moment in time. At some point, because these payoffs, the 3 is actually not 3, right? It will vary all the time. At some point, there will be huge incentive distortions, maybe coming from extreme yield farming opportunities, or something gets hacked. I mean, you all know crypto, right? Like there is a whole bunch of crazy stuff happening all the time, and this distorts these payoffs like crazy. And you don't want to build a system where like 99% of the time you end up in like an equilibrium that you want, but then all of a sudden these incentives are actually totally off, and the whole thing crashes. And I think many crypto systems are currently still built in a way that they rely on the equilibrium being right at every moment in time, and that's dangerous. So I think a really important learning here over the last few years that we want to address, and then interactions. Now, we realized that basically, even if you have the liquidity in the market that you need, you have the collateral in reserve that you need, and the incentives are currently spot on, then still you need actually a fourth ingredient for things to work. You need somebody to actually take those incentives, right? You need somebody, for example, take arbitrage opportunities, run these arbitrage cycles to keep the stable tokens packed. And it seems like a minor point, but if you look at something like the MakerDAO Black Thursday, you see that this was a big part of the problem there, right? Especially during crisis periods, you just cannot expect that people actually do stuff, right? They will sometimes just shy away from doing stuff because things go crazy, they're confused, they maybe have even bigger problems somewhere else and are, trying to spend their time in the best way possible. So even if the incentives are kind of right and liquidity and collateral is there, you just need people to actually do interactions and take profit opportunities at all points in time. And the dangerous thing about this part is that basically this will not be the case during Black Swan type of events, when the market is dry, when people have no idea what to do and maybe just do nothing. All right, so basically we have 5 goals that we saw as underlying structure to all the asks that came our way. We have 4 things that can go wrong with stability as kind of the goal that rules them all. And now we thought about, okay, what are the solution principles? What are the things that underline basically all the solution proposals that we get? And we get a lot of them, right? Like if you talk to people more like on the public sector side, you will probably get a very different proposed solution of what Mento should be and like how it should work and so forth than talking to an economist or a user. And trying to find structure in all these potential solutions is the tough part here as well. What we came up here with is 3 things. 3 solution principles, basically, that I think make up most of the solutions that come our way in some form or another. First is value transfer. So the idea here is always that basically you try to transfer value from somewhere where you don't need it to somewhere where you need it. And I think there are basically 3 different ways, in a sense, to do this. The first one is intertemporal value transfer. If you think about a bond, for example, that's pretty much what this is, right? You give up cash flow today to get cash flows tomorrow. So you basically just move value across time, so you have it available when you need it. Many solutions kind of use that kind of a principle in some form or another. Good to bad state value transfer, which is something like, for example, hedging. If you buy a put option, to hedge some risk, well, you basically pay during a good state, such that you don't have, this huge downside risk if ever this bad state occurs. So it's a good to bad state value transfer. And then there's a third one, which is, I think, much less prominent, but very interesting, and it came up in like a few discussions on potential improvements. It also matters who actually gets hit in the worst case scenario, right? We at Celo have a mission, and we care about the more vulnerable end users that basically might end up using the stable tokens to a large degree. Now, if you can find a mechanism that makes sure that if the worst comes to worst and you have a permanent DPEG, for example, in a stable token, then if at that point in time people holding the stable token are actually people who are not risk averse, people who signed up for that risk in the first place and received a good risk return trade-off for signing up for that, then that's much better than having people that have all their life savings in this currency suffering that hit. Right? So that's a third thing you can do in terms of value transfer that can actually improve things. And so yeah, value transfer underlies a lot of the solutions that came our way. Participation is another principle that we saw in a lot of potential solutions. So basically here, the idea is just, okay, we have this protocol, it tries to achieve certain things. Well, many of those things you cannot really participate in as a user. Why not allow people to help with these things, right? That's a principle that we saw applied in different kind of suggestions on improvements. And then the last one, commitment. It's clear that if you talk about black swan robustness, it's not enough for collateral to be there most of the time, right? You basically need it in very specific situations when things go nuts, right? And I guess here, the idea behind a lot of the solutions that are around is mainly, let's commit people more long-term to certain things. Because then if, we can commit then basically people to do certain things during good states, and they are not able to change what they want to do during crisis periods, which in the end is better for everybody. It's like a prisoner's dilemma kind of thing. If you can agree on taking a certain action and people can actually commit to that, then actually everybody is better off. So I think those three principles make up, to a large degree, all the solutions that are coming our way. They just try to use them differently and put them together differently. Now, we wanted to use kind of these learnings, so kind of the 5 goals, the four things that can go wrong with stability, and like the 3 principles in terms of designing solutions here to work out solutions, basically, to work out innovations on what we can do in Mento 2.0. And I want to talk about 2. I mean, we have limited time, so picked out kind of the 2 things that I'm personally most excited about. And well, the idea here basically is the things that can go wrong are, incentives, liquidity, collateral, and interaction, right? Like that's what we had on the previous slide. Those are really the things that can go wrong with stability. Now, let's assume we get the incentives somewhat right. Then basically, what we would have to achieve is guaranteed liquidity, guaranteed collateral, and guaranteed interactions, right? And then we kind of are pretty safe that things are fine in the stability setup because we have covered all the sources of problems. Now, liquidity, well, liquidity farming is a concept that you all already know, right? And guaranteed liquidity is also not really a new thing. It's basically, well, we would basically shamelessly steal it from something like Olympus DAO, where, that really, I think, is the core innovation of them, where they say, protocol-owned liquidity is something that actually helps because it guarantees liquidity, right? Like, it's not liquidity that moves away in a moment of need. So we would just use a similar principle here, but now I think the really interesting new innovations here are, those 2. Why not use the same principle, like liquidity farming, on collateral and on interaction, on the other 2 things that can go wrong with stability? And, well, what does that mean? Like, how's that supposed to work? Well, basically, you would just allow folks on the collateral side to lock up additional collateral committed to the reserve and be rewarded for doing that in some form or another. And with interactions, a similar thing. You would just incentivize people to provide funds to a future set of automated actions that they cannot basically withdraw those funds from. And you reward people for basically playing that role in the system because they help, right? They are worth getting paid. And in more detail, what does that look like? So how does it actually work if you look at the collateral farming piece? Well, collateral providers, let's call them like that because we all know the liquidity provider setup, I guess. They commit collateral to the reserve, and then during stablecoin contractions, these stable tokens flow into their position on a pro rata basis, and the Celo they provided as collateral, they will flow out on a pro rata basis. Now, during expansions, mechanics are a bit different. So basically, during expansions, Celo dollars have to flow out somehow. And basically, if the collateral providers have Celo dollars in their position, the Celo dollars will flow out of those positions. Otherwise, their position will basically be unaffected. So if you model or if you build in these mechanics, what actually happens is that if you become such a collateral provider, you add collateral to the reserve, you basically become part of the reserve, then as long as Celo stables are pegged, expansions and contractions do not really change the value of your position, right? Because you get $1 worth of collateral for giving out a stable token and the other way around. Now, there are two more technical things to get right here, which are fungibility and how can we ensure that this collateral is not withdrawn when it's needed the most. Well, we can solve those two things rather easily by, well, the first thing, basically having a setup which is similar to how liquidity providers work, and the second thing, which is basically also similar to how liquidity farming works, right? You basically lock up these CP tokens over an expanded period of time and incentivize people to do that. What does that do? Why does that help? Well, it achieves this intertemporal value transfer, right? Because it supports long-term over-collateralization. You basically pay a little today to lock up a lot of additional capital for an extended period of time, which includes the states where you will need it, right? So basically, when you start this out of a position of everything looking good, it's a nice value transfer, intertemporal. Good to bait state value transfer is happening as well, right? You basically have an increased black swan robustness because the value is there no matter kind of what's happening. The value is locked. It cannot be withdrawn. So during black swan ones, nothing really happened, and the collateral would have otherwise left, very likely. Now, even the third one here in terms of value transfer we address, because basically what happens is that these collateral providers, right, they basically sign up for DPEG risk, right? That's what they compensate, because they might end up with only stable tokens in their position if there are a lot of contractions, right? That's not a problem as long as these stable tokens are pegged. If they are not pegged, well, they take a hit, right? And that's kind of the deal. But on the other hand, they are rewarded for doing that with rewards that need some market mechanism to make sure that this is a fair pricing, or fair rewarding. And in the end, and last but not least here, I think participation, democratization of profits, and sustainable growth is really the big strength of this innovation, basically, because it says, well, why not let DeFi users earn rewards by helping stability through being a collateral provider? And these rewards are not, unsustainable as many other rewards I think that we often see in DeFi. Why? Because you're basically solving a problem, right? You are helping by providing this collateral. Very quickly, interaction farming. So we basically try to take the same approach to the next, problem that we have identified of those 4 problems that can go wrong with stability. Interactions, right? We need to make sure that people actually keep on interacting, even in the worst case scenario of, a black swan event. And similar mechanics here. You have interaction providers. They commit funds to an interaction contract. And then the idea is that this contract just basically takes profit opportunities across Mento, other DEXs, and so forth. And the way that is basically carried out is, well, the contract on deployment defines what it does via a convex optimization problem, right? It basically states, I will take, I will optimize this system in the following way. to create arbitrage freeness, for example, between dexes. Now, you can actually do that by having off-chain optimization and then on-chain proof that the solution provided by folks is a valid solution to this optimization problem. And that means that everybody can potentially provide the solution and trigger the interaction and move this whole capital in this contract at every point in time. So yeah, that's, I think, basically taking the same concept and shooting it at the third additional problem, basically, that we identified. IP tokens work very similar then to collateral provider tokens or liquidity provider tokens for that matter. Okay, so what does it achieve? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. We have guaranteed healthy interactions with the protocol that happen at all points in time, and improved market efficiency and so forth. Tiny recap, so we have identified 5 fundamental goals, 4 fundamental things that can go wrong with stability, and 3 fundamental solution principles, and we tried to apply all those things to figure out what 2 innovations could look like that actually improve the system. And those 2 main innovations are collateral farming and interaction farming. There are a couple of other notable improvement proposals that this group arrived at this point, and we will share more details on those in a forum post and on Discord and so forth. Just some notable mentions, basically Mento 1 exchange improvements, something like dynamic parameters, for example. We are thinking about borrow and repay type of function and about a balancer type AMM to further decentralize the reserve. Let's speak in more detail about this async or after this conference, after the talks today. So just quickly, what's next? Today and tomorrow, we are very happy to talk to people in person about these things, get additional feedback. Let's coordinate on Discord in the economics channel there. And then next Monday, we plan to write up a forum post or publish it with more details on the proposed Mento 2 design as it is right now, and start basically the feedback cycle here with the community. To be able to achieve that, we want to create a separate Mento 2 Discord, so we have a more focused approach. And then in 4 weeks, we are open sourcing a cat simulation for Mento 2.0 that we are working on for a while now, that basically puts all these principles, like these new mechanisms and so forth, into action and analyzes them. And we hope, of course, for your participation there. And then also we would like to have bi-weekly community meetings. All right, thank you very much. I will be around if you have any questions or would like to talk.